have next week we're going to have a guest by the name of Ira Foreman, who is the former State Department head of the Office of Anti-Semitism. This is a position for which my colleague and friend Deborah Lipstadt has been nominated and not yet confirmed. And we're hoping that she will be confirmed. It's being held up by the contemporary politics in Washington. And Ira will be talking about, in dialogue with me, really about anti-Semitism and the question of Israel. And we're going to touch on that tonight, but we'll have a much greater depth discussion next week. The week after that, though I'm going to be mindful of schedule because we skip a week, we're going to have Mark Weitzman, who for many years was the diplomatic representative of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and who's also a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, an American delegate. And he's going to talk about anti-Semitism on the internet and in social networks. And you will hear from me a little bit later on that what makes today's anti-Semitism different from the past is that the internet gives it a megaphone and social networks gives it an international social support system. And we're going to understand that in great detail. And then a colleague and a professor of political science, Gilbert Kahn, is going to talk about the peculiar case of anti-Semitism in England in particular, and in Western Europe in general. And those of you who want to remember England, you had Jeremy Corbyn, who was the anti-Labour Party or the anti-Israel leader of the Labour Party, who was tolerant of and made a series of anti-Semitic statements, and who has now been kicked out of the Labour Party as part of after the great election defeat last time. And there was a very peculiar moment in English politics where the chief rabbi, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, published an open letter on the eve of the last election, calling out the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn. And more importantly, he was immediately backed up by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it was clear that there was coordination to finally put the moral importance of condemning anti-Semitism to the forefront of English religious society. And then Jeremy Corbyn went down to a significant defeat. And finally, we're going to have a wonderful privilege, which is who better to discuss the evolving nature of anti-Semitism over the past 70 years than one of the key architects of American Jewish policy toward the issue of anti-Semitism, and that is Abraham Foxman. Abe Foxman will join us for an overview in dialogue with me, and we will be able to consider where we are now and how does it differ from anti-Semitism in the past. And he'll also be able to talk in a certain way even more candidly than he could when he had an official position about certain strategies that we should undertake to combat anti-Semitism. This should be a deeply comprehensive treatment and understanding of anti-Semitism, and we're hoping that you can join us for the entire series. And if you can't, we're hoping that we'll be able to post broadcasts of elements of the series so that you can catch up. And my job today is to give you an overview of anti-Semitism. Let me begin by saying that we're going to find a couple of things. We're going to find that there's a debate as to how you spell anti-Semitism. There's a debate as to how you define anti-Semitism. There's a debate as to how you recognize anti-Semitism. And then there's a debate about how large a crisis anti-Semitism is in American society, and also how large a crisis it is in the world, on the world stage today. I'm going to reserve, in order not to distract, I'm going to reserve a couple of comments at the end to the situation today in the Ukraine. but I think that since it's at the forefront of our minds when I conclude my remarks, and I don't want to distract us, you'll permit me to have a couple of moments of comments on Ukraine. And again, everything I say is based on my work. I don't represent the memorial in that, and I'm not speaking for any institutional base. I'm speaking as a scholar who studied this material for years. And I want to underscore Sydney's point. Anti-Semitism really is the longest hatred. And one of the ways you have to look at anti-Semitism is a game we played as little kids called the whack-a-mole. You know what a whack-a-mole is? You hit something down and something pops up elsewhere. Anti-Semitism has morphed in multiple fashions, in multiple ways, but it really is, in terms of the world today, the longest hatred. I'm also going to make one comment on the Whoopi Goldberg controversy and where you can and cannot understand anti-Semitism on the scale of racism, because I think Whoopi Goldberg Whoopi Goldberg and the FBI statement about Colleyville are tremendous examples of where ignorance was at play rather than malice. But it's very important that we combat the ignorance that's involved. Let me begin by asking you to do a couple of pieces of work and understand the following. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source. Let me repeat the statement. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source. Is the source religious? Is the source economic? Is the source political? Is the source social? Is the source racial, as in the Nazi case? Anti-Semitism differs as to its goal, depending on its source. If anti-Semitism is religious, the source is one, the goal is one of two things: either the elimination of Judaism or the conversion of Jews. If anti-Semitism is economic, the request is a diminishment, the goal is a diminishment of Jewish economic power, the marginalization of Jews from the economic life of the nation, their isolation, and the like. If the source of anti-Semitism is social, then what you want is exclusion. The classic example of that is Groucho Marx's wonderful line, "I would not want to belong to a club that would have me as a member." Meaning that his response jokingly was that he didn't want to be in a club. He wanted to be in a club that would have excluded Jews because that meant it was high society. By the way, on that social isolation, one of the very interesting things is that led to Jews to create alternate institutions. One of the reasons that Miami has Mount Sinai Hospital is there was a time in which Jews could not be admitted to hospitals and doctors could not practice in hospitals. And therefore, what did the Jewish community do? It provided for its own, and it created institutions which today are non-denominational and fully participatory and welcoming of Jewish and non-Jewish staff, Jewish and non-Jewish patients, and Jews are no longer facing that type of social isolation. There is political anti-Semitism as a source, and the goal of political anti-Semitism is a combination of, in its most extreme, it is political expulsion. What happened in Spain, what happened in England, what happened in France. In other forms, it is a diminishment of Jewish political power. Listen to the chant, "The Jews will not replace us." The Jews will not replace us means that the opposition is Jewish political power, with the idea that Jews are going to replace the political power or integrate into the political power that's involved. In Nazi anti-Semitism, the source was racial, and the goal was first what Daniel Goldhagen called eliminationist anti-Semitism, which then became exterminationist anti-Semitism. If the goal is to eliminate, you want to get rid, why is it racial? The 1935 Nuremberg laws defined the Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. That meant that you even had Roman Catholic nuns, Roman Catholic priests, and Protestant ministers who were defined by the Nazi Party as Jews, by the German state as Jews, and by the church as Christians. And if you want a vivid example of that, the last building standing in the Warsaw Ghetto, the last building standing in the Warsaw Ghetto was a Roman Catholic church, staffed by Roman Catholic priests, attended by people whom the state defined as Jewish and who were practicing Catholics who wanted to go to church on Sunday. And that was the one building in the ghetto that was not burned to the ground. And what was Whoopi Goldberg's mistake? Whoopi Goldberg saw races. First of all, she saw Jews as a race. And what's the best argument that Jews are not a race? Go to Israel and see the multicolored nature of Jews and multiracial nature of Jews. Ashkenazim and Sephardim, people from Arab countries, Mizrahim, also Ethiopians. And Jews are multi-race. Jews from India, Jews from China, and even think of what happened in Colleyville. In Colleyville, the terrorists who entered and held the Jews hostage wanted to call the rabbi of Central Synagogue because he believed what? That the Jews control the world, and Central Synagogue must be the center of the axis of Jewish power. Who is the rabbi of Central Synagogue? The rabbi of Central Synagogue is an Asian American Jew. Multiracial nature of Judaism. And she saw racism in American context, which looks like it's black and white. In Germany, Jews were defined as a race, and they sought to eliminate the Jews as a race, and they wanted to eliminate Jewish blood. They didn't care about the identity you held, the practices the traditions you upheld, the practices you undertook, your religious identity, your religious practice, your belief in God. If you had Jewish blood, that was sufficient. Example, Edith Stein, a Roman Catholic nun, was murdered because she had Jewish parents. My own teacher, whom I studied with, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, was a great Protestant theologian from 1913 to 35 in Germany, and an American Protestant major thinker from 1940 to 1967 in the United States, a wonderful Protestant theologian. And you see that I left out 5 years because in 1935, he was defined as Jewish because he had Jewish grandparents. And in fact, he had a cousin whose name was Franz Rosenzweig, who was one of the great philosophers of the first half of the great Jewish philosophers of the first half of the 20th century. So Jews are multiracial, and Jews being multiracial, we also allow conversion, and consequently, we can't be defined in a racial category, but we were defined in a racial category by the Nazis. Third point, remember, anti-Semitism differs as to its source. It differs as to its goal. It also differs as to its priority. One of the great advantages Jews have had in the United States is that we were never the top priority for hatred. We didn't win that contest. Other groups were hated more than Jews. In Nazi Germany, there is absolute incontrovertible evidence that we were the first, second, and third priority of the Nazi state. and the elimination of the Jews even was in tension with the desire to win World War II. Hitler made his first known anti-Semitic statement in 1919, and in his last will and testament on the day before he died, the last statement was, above all, I enjoin the German people to continue the struggle against Jewry. So we were the first priority, and one of the evidences of that is the two times that Jews were most intensely deported to death camps was 1942 and 1944. What described 42? 42 was the wartime in the German efforts to conquer the Soviet Union. It was the moment at which Hitler's troops were being stuck in Stalingrad. They were being stuck on the outskirts of Moscow. And resources then were used to deport the Jews beginning in February and March 1942, to deport the Jews to death camps, resources that could have been used, trains that could have been used, personnel that could have been used to fight the war, to supply the soldiers with material. And when is the second time of the Great Deportation? 437,402 Jews were deported from Hungary between the 15th of May and the 8th of July, 1944. And you all know that 1944, the Soviet army was on the march against Germany in the east. And we had D-Day on June 6, 1944. That did not slow down the deportation of the Jews because it was the absolute priority of the German government. In the United States, you could say Jews are down the list of those who are to be opposed. There are much more antagonism to African Americans, much more antagonism to the Hispanic community, much more antagonism to immigrants, arguably equal antagonism to the Muslim community and the Jewish community, which is antagonized. And part of our safety in America has been that we have not been a high priority. Last point, lest I drive you again to understanding its fundamentals. There's an axiom. The more stable a society is, the more safe a Jewish community is. Instability in a society is the prescription of danger for the Jewish community. And what is unique about America today is that we are going through multiple crises. And I'm not asking any of you to agree with all of the description of crises, but let me list them. We have been going through clearly a health crisis, which has led to an economic crisis. We're going through a crisis of political legitimacy, with a percentage of the population believing that the election was not legitimate and the president of the United States is not duly elected. We're going through a crisis of polarization. We were going through in 2019 and 2020, and you're seeing a part of it today in a crisis of social justice. And the young are feeling that more acutely than older Americans. We're going through a climate crisis, and we're going through a crisis that is a worldwide crisis about democracy. Let's leave out whether you agree with every description of every crisis, but let's admit to a very simple thing. We are in a society and in a world, and forget about for a moment about what happened today and this week in Ukraine, in a world that is unstable, and instability is a prescription of danger for the Jews. Now, not all news is bad. Let me repeat that because we Jews don't hear that all the time. Not all news is bad. Let me give you 4 parts of good news Not that it outweighs everything else, but let me give you 4 parts of good news. Paradox number 1. According to the Pew survey, Judaism is the most admired religion in America. And it has been such since 2013 and 2020. Now, before we take that as wonderful news, let me explain what I mean by that. It means, in essence, that Judaism is the least unpopular or the least disrespected religion in America. I don't have to tell you that the Roman Catholic Church is going through a tremendous crisis between pulpit and pew. The impact on the legitimacy of the Roman Catholic Church in the pews by the crisis of sexual abuse cannot be overstated. It has shown the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church to be complicit, and it has bankrupted some churches, and it has removed the aura of the church and has reached as high as the Pope Emeritus. The second thing about Roman Catholicism is that though Roman Catholic teaching has not changed, Catholics tend to divorce in precisely the same percentages as other Americans, and Roman Catholics tend to have abortions in precisely the same percentage as other Americans. And consequently, there is a gap between pulpit and pews, and a gap that has created a crisis within the church itself. And many younger people call themselves lapsed Catholics. We, by the way, have a different problem that we can deal with Jewish identity. We have lots of Jews who declare themselves Jews, but no religion, which is an interesting category that we have not had identifiable. Protestantism is divided between evangelical and mainstream. Evangelical is divided generationally and divided also politically, and divided about the closeness of the established evangelical community to the Republican Party. And the younger evangelicals also dissent on the issue of gays, as they have been part of that entire generation, which does not regard, which accepts gays as part of the landscape of American society and doesn't delegitimate them and doesn't go against them in any significant way. Muslims have been associated with terrorism, therefore they're not particularly, they are particularly feared and disrespected. Nobody understands Eastern religion, consequently Judaism is the religion that is least disrespected and consequently, ironically, most admired. Let's take the second piece of good news, which is 2 sources of anti-Semitism have declined. Communism used to be a major source of anti-Semitism. If you asked what was the largest source of anti-Semitism in the 1980s, you would have had to answer the Soviet Union. And ironically, we have a situation where Putin may not be good for Israel, but Putin has a personal affection for Jews. His neighbor growing up was a religious Jew who adopted him, as it were, almost as a stepson. And the most powerful religious organization in Russia is Chabad, because of the fact that Putin's neighbors were Chabadniks at a time when you had great difficulty being Chabadniks. The second element of it is that the Roman Christianity is no longer the same source of anti-Semitism as it was when I was growing up. You have a straight line in the changes that were involved in Roman Catholic teaching, from Nostra Aetate, which is the idea that Jews were not responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, but sin was, to the recognition by that was John the 23rd, to the Saint John the 23rd, to the recognition by Saint John Paul II of the state of Israel, and the incredible remark, and by the way, his prayer at the Western Wall, and the incredible remarks of John Paul II when he said that anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. something that would have been music to Jews' ears for 2,000 years of the sojourn between Jews and Christians, when he said anti-Semitism was anti-Christian. And what he then said is, he also said that he apologized for the anti-Semitism of Christians, not of Christianity, but of Christians. And the third change that just took place under Pope Francis is Pope Francis ended the mission to the Jews. In other words, he said Jews are at one with God and Jews don't have to convert. The last piece of good news we don't know about yet, but let me say that one of the largest sources of anti-Semitism in the last decades has been a politicized nature of Muslim anti-Semitism. And that is that throughout the centuries, if I had been a Jew offered to live under Christian domination or Muslim domination, at any point but the last 75 years, I would, one, say I don't want to live under domination by anybody, and two, I would say essentially that I would prefer to live under Muslim domination, because under Muslim domination, Jews were a respected religion, albeit that had to pay a penalty, for its religious practice, not an equal religion, but a respected one. We were regarded as people of the book, and consequently, we had legal rights. What is the good news? And since the rise of the State of Israel and really the taking off of Zionism, the Muslim community has regarded the Jews in a political context rather than solely in a religious context. And the Abraham Accords, which is now an accords of the elite, government to government, there may come a day when that is translated into people to people. And it's almost the equivalent of in divorce when the parents have to say, when do we tell our children? And the most important element of that is, when do you tell the Arab populations, the Shiite population versus the Sunni population, when do you tell them that Israel is not the source of all evil, and that essentially, since Israel is a knowledge-based economy equipped for the 21st century, that an alliance with Israel, a strategic alliance with Israel against Iran, is in the benefit of our population. That may diminish over a period of time Muslim anti-Semitism. That's the good news. Now let's go back to what is different. Manish Tanah anti-Semitism hazeh from previous anti-Semitism. Why is this different? And I want to suggest essentially three elements that are there. Number one, we live in a climate in which the expression of hatred is now permissible, and it's regarded as a statement of authenticity. If you hate, you can say that you hate. In previous, and most especially in the post-Holocaust era, if you didn't like Jews, you didn't speak about it in public. You may have said snide remarks on the side, but you didn't go public with it, and you didn't go strongly with it, and you didn't go out with it because you didn't want to be associated with what? With Nazism and and that type of anti-Semitism. We now live in a society in which you no longer signal it, you say it directly. The internet has given us a megaphone, because for very little money, an individual can now broadcast all over the world their anti-Semitism, and they cannot be isolated and cannot be contained because they now have social networks that reinforce their beliefs. And consequently, it is a global phenomenon. Let me give you one very specific example. And look at the media, for example. The media sometimes calls it manifestos. I prefer to call it rants. You had the killing in Christchurch in New Zealand, and a rant by the killer. That rant then was dropped into the phones. Somebody walking through the library of Syracuse University put that that racist anti-Semitic rant on every student's phone in the library. And all of a sudden you had a global manifestation of this. You have a global manifestation and a global explosion of this because of the power of the internet and because of the mutual elements of the social support networks. All of this becomes absolutely essential to understanding the nature and the character of anti-Semitism today. So you have the bad news, you have the good news, you have the tremendous power that the anti-Semites now have. And you also have one other thing, which is a combination of terrible news and a little bit of good news. Terrible news is there is now anti-Semitism on the extreme left and anti-Semitism on the extreme right in the United States. The only piece of good news in that is they can't quite unite because the far left supports immigration, the far right is vigorously anti-immigration. And consequently, they cannot be in a direct alliance, though both of them are anti-Semitic in a different way. Jews are regarded in certain quarters of the right. Jews are regarded in three ways that are problematic. The first way is they are regarded as advocates of policies that are diminishing white Christian power. That's what's meant in Charlottesville when they say the Jews will not replace us. Let me unpack that in a certain way. If you ask the average American how many Jews there are in America, nobody will come up with the exact figure. They will think there are between 30, 40, and 50 million Jews in America because Jews are public and their presence is very well known and very well seen in society. But how can it be that they could chant in Charlottesville, the Jews will not replace us? The answer is Jews were seen as advocates for policies that displaced white Christian power. And the reality is, if you lived in my generation, you understood that my generation experienced the breaking of the glass ceiling and the empowerment of the Jewish community and of the Jewish people, and also of a different type of Jew who came into American political power. I can give you an example. Stuart Eisenstadt, who is Carter's chief of domestic policy, was at that point something that was unusual then, but not unusual today. He was a publicly identifiable, religiously observant, albeit non-Orthodox Jew, who when push came to shove could walk into Jimmy Carter's office after Jimmy Carter banned all immigration from Iran and say to the president, you can't do that because you're going to endanger the Jewish and the Baha'i community. And that is, you have to make an exception for those who face religious persecution. Why did he do that? Because he heard of an American inaction with regard to the Holocaust, and he wasn't going to stand idly by and see the Iranian Jewish community imperiled. You saw the role that we played in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment with Richard Pearl and Mark Talisman, and the heroic measures that the American Jewish community took to save Soviet Jewry. And part of that was all of a sudden, not only did Jews feel that they had power within the American government, but they felt comfortable of expressing that power to advance Jewish or Judeo-centric purposes. And we made the Soviet Jewry movement a movement about human rights, but also a movement clearly about Jewish rights and rights to immigration. And that, by the way, ironically, not only saved Soviet Jewry, but there's a new book out called The Ransom of the Jews, which shows how it saved Romanian Jews as well, who were able to emigrate to Israel. So What we have is that for some on the right wing, we are essentially the obstacles to the creation of a white Christian society. And we are regarded as an obstacle. And consequently, there is anti-Semitism on that front, and it's an anti-Semitism that is growing. On the left, there is also the sense that Jews are identified. There's an opposition to Israel that leads to an expression of anti-Semitism, and also the idea of Jews' identification with capitalism. We also have an anti-Semitism on the far right that can be based on stupidity and ignorance, and also on what we would have to call conspiracy theories in a very dramatic way. Let me use an example. I don't want to mention the name, but you all know a political figure. The comparison of Mass to Jewish stars ends up being ridiculous. Mass are designed to save people. Jewish stars were designed to identify people so that they could be what? Annihilated, ultimately destroyed. The other element of it, one congresswoman says Jews got gold stars. Gold is a subliminal association with money. She spoke about the comparing Nancy Pelosi to the gazpacho police, presuming that she meant to say the Gestapo, but gazpacho sounds just like it. If I had the choice between eating gazpacho and eating the Gestapo, I would choose gazpacho any day of the week. And I presume everybody here would also join me in saying that gazpacho is much more pleasant than the Gestapo. The idea that the Rothschilds started the fires by laser beams from outer space becomes a lunatic fringe that gets echoed and echoed and echoed within society. Let's now let's talk about Israel and anti-Semitism, and also conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. Zionism was founded as a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. It was started by assimilated Jews who believed that were disappointed in the idea that human rights would be sufficient to protect the Jewish community, and felt that the Jewish condition had to be changed. Jews had to become a nation like any other nation, a nation with a flag, with a sovereign state, an army, a flag, an anthem, and a land. And for a while it looked, and especially for those of us who remember back into the post-67 and also for a period of time, looked like Israel could quell the fires of anti-Semitism. What we've discovered since the Zionism is racism revolution, all the way through, is that Israel can not only quell the fires, but Israel can fuel the flames. And how do we distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel, which everybody has on the right and the left, religious and secular, political right, political left, etc., etc. Everybody has legitimate criticisms of Israel, none more legitimate than the criticisms offered in Israel. How do we distinguish between that and anti-Semitism? And here I would want to suggest two ways of looking at it. One is Potter Stewart. Potter Stewart once defined, he said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And and if you don't mind the comparison of anti-Semitism to pornography, many of us know it when we see it. But Natan Sharansky gave us a wonderful way of remembering it as a slogan. It's called the 3 Ds: double standards, delegitimation, and demonization. Double standards. If you judge Israel by one standard and everybody else by another, then you're bordering on anti-Semitism. If you go to delegitimation, let's take a very simple example. Israel is established on land that belonged to a native population. I hate to tell you this, so is the United States, so is Canada, so is Australia, and so are 32 other countries. So if you say, therefore, Israel has no right to exist, but you don't say the United States has no right to exist, Australia has no right to exist, Canada has no right to exist, then you're engaging in a combination of delegitimation and double standards. And the most telling of all is what we call demonization, which is where you regard the Jews not only as wrong in Israel, and Israel has done plenty that could be considered wrong, but you regard them as demonic figures in the same way in which, the Jews drink the blood libels, the poisoning of the wells. And we see some of this, by the way, on the internet, the fact that we had a Jewish CEO whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust and whose parents were in Auschwitz, who developed what the vaccine means. That if you look on the internet, Jews developed the coronavirus in order to benefit economically from the vaccine. And the fact that Israel, for example, established itself as the testing ground for vaccination, and its medical material has been so essential all the way through, is precisely the reason why some in the conspiracy theories say Israel brought us the vaccines. Israel's political influence is regarded as a matter of money. AIPAC is said to have controlled Congress. All of these things become, if the oil industry has the right to lobby, why don't Friends of Israel have the right to lobby as well? This is a question of double standards, delegitimation, and demonization. Let me take issue with one thing that the Jewish community should pay attention to. We've all seen BDS. And BDS is boycott, divestment, and sanction. I think we empower BDS by giving it attention. BDS has had no impact whatsoever economically on Israel. And those of us who have a long-term memory and compare that, for example, with the Arab boycott, see the futility of BDS. Plus, BDS is not terribly effective to an Israel that is integrated into the technological, into the interconnected technological world in which we live. When I go on campuses and people say BDS, I say, terrific. Let's begin. Give me your iPhone. Stop using Waze. Stop using Skype. Let's get rid of the Microsoft programs that are used in labs and used in libraries, because all of these are a result of Israeli research. Let's get rid of the vaccines that are developed, of the technological, and et cetera, et cetera. It's an attempt to isolate Israel and treat it as precisely and uniquely demonic, worthy of boycott. We don't boycott China, which is committing an actual genocide. We're seeing the outrage toward Russia that is developing because of its invasion. So we have to think of whether BDS is worthy of the attention we're giving it, whether that merely fuels the flames that are involved in that. Let me touch on a couple of questions that have been asked. We see an increased use of the distortion of the Holocaust for political purposes. Please comment on this with regard to anti-Semitism. We have succeeded beyond belief in establishing the Holocaust as the gold standard of evil, and Nazi Germany as the personification of evil. That means when all sorts of people want to say something is bad, it is almost irresistible for them to shout Nazi or Holocaust. So if you're against masks, you turn over and you say yellow star. If you're Vladimir Putin, what do you accuse the Ukraine of? You accuse the Ukraine of being Nazi. Jewish president, a Jewish prime minister, a Jewish president, a Jewish prime minister, and a president who said, one set of grandparents were killed in the fields outside of their home. Another set of grandparents did what? They fought. Another grandfather fought Nazi Germany in the Soviet army. You can't resist the comparison to the Holocaust. Everybody says Holocaust, Holocaust, Holocaust. And I always have to say that you need to begin to compare and to contrast, and there is no equivalence to the Holocaust at this point. Now, Susan and Alfred Feingold have asked a very interesting thing. How do you explain the absence of anti-Semitism in Asian culture? Number one, Jews have not been very present in Asian culture. And the Chinese in particular hear a couple of things against the Jews, and they say, what's wrong with that? They hear that Jews are interested in money. What's wrong with that? They hear that Jews are good traders, Traders, not traitors. And they say, what's wrong with that? The Chinese have been traders for millennium. They also hear that Jews stick together and trust one another. And an awful lot of Chinese culture for many generations was built on trust. There's also something called positive anti-Semitism. Now, before you shoot me on that, let me explain to you and give you an example. The Israeli ambassador to Japan was visited by the president of Toyota, who turned to him and he said, we are considering making an investment in Africa. What do you think about it? And when he was visited by the president of, and I'm going to deliberately leave it unsaid who was the president of Toyota then and who was the Israeli ambassador. The Israeli ambassador said, I'm sitting with a man who's worth billions of dollars, and I'm having difficulty living in Japan even on an ambassadorial salary, because what Israel pays with me, it's regarded as a hardship position because it's more expensive than the Israeli unionized foreign ministry will allow me to pay. My staff is taking food home from receptions because they can't always afford fresh food, and they use fruit and the like, and they take it home and we overorder. He said, now, why is he coming to me? He believes that I'm part of the Jewish control of the world. And I believe he believes the Jews control the world. And therefore, he wants to know what the protocols of elders of Zion would say about an investment in Africa. Do I tell him we don't control the world? Or do I play along with him and say, I'll get back to you, I'll consult my foreign ministry and my finance ministry and see it? Because ultimately, if you are perceived to be having power, it is almost as good as having power. I give a joke to a certain generation. Henry Winkler, who played Fonzie in Happy Days, never was in a fight. He was regarded as so intimidating that nobody ever wanted to fight him. Short little guy, not terribly heavy, without any known fighting skills, but he intimidated everyone. That's what we sometimes call positive anti-Semitism. You also have another phenomenon taking place, which is anti-Semitism without Jews, which is that the Jew becomes the target without Jews. You had the same echo in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us was echoed in Poland, where the Jewish community may be 8, 10, 20,000 people. Once Jews were 10% of society, today they are a minuscule percentage of society, and Poland itself was undergoing the greatest prosperity it's ever had. And how are they chanting the Jews will not replace us? How are these small number of people going to replace them? But they have anti-Semitism without Jews, because the image of the Jews so dominates Polish society that it becomes anti-Semitic. Now, one other point about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, which is that we've gone through a double stage. Communism denied that the Jews were involved in the Holocaust at all. People who were killed were victims of Soviet citizens who were victimized by the evil, awful Nazis. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of communism, you had the idea that we have to tell the truthful part of our historical past. So different societies studied their past and came to terms, and finally you could say that terrible J-E-W word, Jew, and the Holocaust was understood and institutions were created. All of a sudden, new research was coming forth by people who had known the truth all along but couldn't dare publish it. You now have a third stage, which is the rise of an authoritarian nationalist community leadership, in most especially in Eastern Europe, where one of the things they try to do is to rewrite the history of the Holocaust. So Poland has the idea that what? You can't say that Polish institutions aided or abetted the Holocaust. You can't describe the, and they created legal obstacles, civil and first criminal and then civil, with regard to telling the truth about the Holocaust. Hungary had a historian who so rewrote the text of the Hungarian Holocaust Museum that the Jews withdrew from the Hungarian Holocaust Museum because they did not regard it as having integrity and authority. So the Holocaust becomes disputed because it's almost a Rorschach as to how the population wants to deal with their own nationalism, with the truth, and how willing they are to confront the dark side of their own history. And that becomes an absolutely pivotal element that is critical and important. And you also have something else which is developed right now. And this is, again, something we have to look at. On January 6th, you had a man wear Auschwitz staff, meaning that the problem was reflected also in a slogan that appears on a shirt, 6MWE. 6MWE is a code saying 6 million wasn't enough. We have a wonderful situation. They no longer deny the Holocaust. They merely believe it was inadequate because it should have annihilated what? More Jews. And they want to complete the Holocaust and the like. So you have people who want to repeat, increase, intensify, and complete the Holocaust. And that creates a new situation in our society and is reflected in a dramatic and important way. Let me take a couple of more questions if you want to put it on the chat. And then we'll say that I believe that I've laid out for you what is sufficient for 5 weeks of intense and important discussion. Any more questions, please put them in the chat if you have them. And let me say then, and in the absence of such questions, let me say a couple of things about what's happening in the Ukraine. The idea that the Jewish community would be rooting for the Ukrainians really is quite astounding, but absolutely necessary. Remember, Ukrainians were partially perpetrators of the Holocaust, and not only victims. And that is that Ukrainians staffed the concentration camps of Belzhytsk, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Ukrainians also were the people who were involved in deportation, who were also involved in deportation of Jews. They participated, for example, in the quotation marks liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. They reinforced German troops. And consequently, what you had is that we now have a situation in which you have Putin attempting to reestablish the Soviet Empire. And he and Angela Merkel, who is the former Chancellor of Germany, both lived through one day that she regarded as the greatest day of her life, and he regarded as the worst day of his life. And that was the day, November 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall fell. For Merkel, it was freedom. For Putin, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union and all that that represented. This destabilizes Europe. It destabilizes Europe in the most fundamental way. You've seen deep responses by countries that don't normally get into a political debate, like Finland, like Switzerland. Germany has already increased its defense budget considerably. It's also, for the first time, exported weapons to the Ukraine because it's afraid that it's next. Poland is frightened silly. I am working in Poland, and my colleagues were in tears. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of them are fearful of the reestablishment of the Soviet Empire. There's also something else which you may not remember, which is the Ukrainians have a deep and profound hate for Russia because Stalin committed genocide in the Ukraine in the 1930s, something called the Holodomor, by starving the Ukrainian population. And Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, and they absorbed all of their food production and didn't feed the Ukrainian population. Somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million people were killed in the 1930s, which was about 20% or 18% of their population. So it's an incredible hatred. These are the great grandparents of today's youngsters. They would be the grandparents of my generation. They would be the great grandparents of a younger generation, and consequently, there is no love lost between the Soviets, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And I think that we have to watch this for the destabilization of Europe. There are some 300,000 Jews in the Ukraine, and they are a population that is vulnerable. I don't think they're the only ones that are vulnerable, but they're vulnerable. And Israel has a tremendous balancing act because there are also Jews in Russia and Jews in the Ukraine. And we have a tremendous, we have a geopolitical problem, we have a problem with Europe, and we have a problem with the idea of uniting, as it were, ethnic Russians with the homeland of Russia. That, for many of us, resembles the 1938 request by Hitler, demand by Hitler. Request is a clean word. Demand by Hitler to what? To receive the Sudetenland. And remember, Hitler said that that was his last territorial demand in Europe. I think it's clear that Putin, and I'm not comparing Putin to Hitler, but Putin, this is not going to be his last territorial demand. So an awful lot is at stake. And America itself is committed to doing a lot, except for troops. And again, we saw an escalation today that is tremendous, because the escalation today was to begin to bring in, to put nuclear forces on alert. Even though Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons, and there is no idea that America or Europe would use nuclear weapons against the Russians. So this is an indication of upping the ante and increasing the pressure in a very dramatic way. Sharon, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Michael. And on behalf of all of us at the Holocaust Memorial and the Zachor Society, I want to thank you so much for unpacking and to begin the conversation with us about anti-Semitism and what we know is the longest hatred. We thought, of course, many of us thought that with the Shoah, we saw the end of anti-Semitism, but it's been a long road for us, and it's frightening for us to be able to see it again in our lifetime. This is part of our history. If we are students of the Jewish history, we know that we're going to be celebrating Purim soon, and we know that anti-Semitism goes far back, even into Purim, when they just tried to destroy the Jewish people. So we're looking forward to next Sunday night at 7:30. Everyone will receive another reminder in Zoom, where we'll be able to delve deeper into the subject of anti-Semitism in Israel, what it looks like in detail, when we can determine it's a political question and when is it something more ferocious than that. So thank you to everyone that participated tonight, that tuned in to watch, and we appreciate it. We'll see you back next Sunday. Thank you.